Well, here we are at the very last module. I hope you all had a great Thanksgiving break, a little bit of a reprieve, were able to spend time with loved ones in whatever way that might have looked for you this year, and that everybody is ready to kind of hit the ground running again as we get through these last couple of weeks of the semester, which I know you guys have been working really, really hard at, and so I'm really proud of all of you for the work and effort that you put in throughout the semester. So at this point, pretty much everything except for the final discussion board and your theoretical orientation papers have been submitted and graded. So you should have a pretty good understanding of where you are in the class. If you have any questions, concerns, please, I do encourage you to reach out with any kind of questions and concerns for me sooner than later, as I kind of wrap up my last couple of weeks of a pregnancy. I can't stress this enough. I literally could be dipping out of the class at any moment, although I don't expect that to happen. I think I will make it until the end of the semester, but you never know. So if you have questions for me, please feel free to let me know what those are, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I possibly can. If for some reason you don't get a typical response from me, then that's probably a good indication that I've had a baby. But nevertheless, please reach out if you need me. So if you're looking at the syllabus and the course schedule for this week's module, for our final module 15, you'll notice that what I would typically do is have a module 16 for semesters, right? But since the semester was a little bit odd, a little bit condensed, module 16 typically is positive psychology, with module 15 being focused on multicultural counseling. And so I didn't want to delete either one of those content areas. And so I just kind of combined them together. So you'll see within module 15, you're going to see a module 16 makeup, essentially. That's just the best way for me to label that, so I can easily get it out of the module 15 the next time I teach this class. So with that, the discussion board is, instead of 2 points, it's going to be 4 points, a little bit more in depth, if you will, for this week. And I know that they don't go hand in hand necessarily, multicultural counseling theory and positive psychology, but make the connections where you can, if you can. We'll get through it, right? Module 15, the discussion does focus on a video that I'm going to have you watch. It should work. If for some reason it doesn't, let me know sooner than later so I can try to figure out alternative access for you guys to get into it. But it's really an example of multicultural counseling in session, the intake and follow-up and what that actually looks like. And so really at this point, what I want you to be doing, you've had the role play sessions with your peers, you've had mock counseling sessions with people in your world. And so now I want you to be kind of viewing another counseling session and taking some notes and being actively listening and reflecting on the counseling session that you're watching, because this is kind of really what you would do in real life, right? You're going to be taking some notes during session. You're going to be doing some documentation. When you get into practicum and internship, you're going to be doing a lot of work with supervisors where you're watching them while they practice and kind of getting that vicarious learning in. So that's really what I want you to do with this last discussion post. And I'll use Pamela Hayes' addressing framework as a way to guide you, really. So with, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. With the theoretical orientation paper, it is open and available to you to submit. Please feel free to do that whenever you're ready. I'm going to just kind of grade them as they're submitted. So again, in case anything happens with this kid, I can have as many of those done as possible. It will be due on the 9th, unless something comes up for you and you notify me beforehand, there's not going to be any opportunity to have a late submission here. So grades have to be turned in at a certain time, and not only that, but I'll be out. So please, just start submitting those whenever, as you get them done. For the paper itself, So I provided you with a rubric and a little bit of an overview of what I'm expecting in terms of the paper. Make sure to review that. I'm not trying to trick you, as I normally, I don't do that. You all know that if you've had me before, which I think everybody has. So I'm not trying to trick you. Follow the rubric. You follow the rubric. You put in the work. You're going to get the points. You're going to be fine. But really, you know, there's specific areas of content that I want you to be focusing on when you're developing your theoretical orientation. Now, this paper, I feel like, is an actual practical paper for you down the road, because in all honesty, if any of you are expected to apply to a doctoral program in the future, or depending on what jobs you might be applying for, people ask for this. People ask for theoretical orientation statements. And so usually they, you know, if you're being asked to describe your theoretical orientation by a potential employer or even a doctoral program, it's going to be limited to like 1 or 2 pages. This is, of course, a little bit longer. Please adhere to the page limit. I don't need a 10-page paper about your theoretical orientation. But nevertheless, I hope this gives a good foundation for you in case you ever need to pull from that later on if you're applying to a job or another level of education. Or it could be really useful because some agencies want to have this information posted on their websites. And so they want to have, you know, like your nice little picture of you as the counselor, and then a little bit of a bio of who you are and your education, but also how you practice. You know, what is your orientation to counseling practice? And so I wanted to get you guys thinking about this now before you get into those practical application those times when you're going to be actually practicing in an internship and a practicum. And this could also be useful for you when you're interviewing for practicum and internship as well, because sometimes there are interviews that go along with that. It's not always, especially now in the with COVID and the mess that has made with practicum and internship, it's not always as cut and dry getting into a practicum and internship, as some of you may have already found out. And so you may be actually interviewing, competing with against other individuals. And so some of these questions, what your orientation to counseling is, actually do come up. So I don't think there's anything, again, outside the norm. Make sure to be really following APA style. I really want you to consider the multicultural aspects related to the counseling theory that you feel like you're gravitating towards, or that you've been practicing in some of those sessions. I want you to kind of dissect it a little bit. Tell me what you think the strengths are and the limitations. Remember, not every theory, not every orientation is perfect. And so we have to be able to recognize where those limitations come in and where we may need to modify some of our techniques or how we approach different situations with specific clients. So I want you to be a little bit critical about that as well. And I want you to be specific too. You know, don't just tell me that something something is a good fit with individuals from various cultures. I want you to tell me how. How is that a good fit? What techniques might you be applying? How might you actually be using that theoretical orientation with a diverse population of individuals? So yeah, I think that kind of that's a pretty good review of the paper itself. Again, if you have any questions, please do let me know on that one. So let's get into, I'm really going to be focusing on multicultural counseling theory today because, again, it's a big component of the paper and I wanted to spend more time doing that. Positive psychology is relatively new in the grand scheme of things, and if you took the VIA survey, I think, whenever you guys entered into the program, so you should have some experience with positive psychology on that end, but because it's so new, there are tons of resources out there in positive psychology. I put some web links in the module content folder for you as well. You can see, the developers of positive psychology are still around, still practicing in Pennsylvania, and still putting out a lot of good work. So, so if you are interested in seeing them actually speaking about positive psychology, you can go to their website, you can look at the YouTube videos, and if we were to ever actually get into a world again where we go to conferences, these folks are regularly presenting at conferences, which is pretty neat as well. Positive psychology, I like it. It's not all rainbows and unicorns and happy faces that I think it kind of initially got a bad rap by just people thinking that it just focused on the good aspects of people's lives and kind of pushed everything else to the side. And really, positive psychology does address some of those negative aspects of people's lives, but always focusing on somebody's strengths, their character, their innate ability to build themselves up. So it's a nice framework, I think, and it works well in kind of those brief, short-term settings that people might be working. So, but back to multicultural counseling. Our textbook does not have a chapter on multicultural counseling. I think it does a nice job of infusing multicultural counseling perspectives within each of those chapters, but I think that is probably one of my biggest issues with the text, is that there's not a dedicated chapter to multicultural counseling. With that being said, there's plenty of information out there about it. And so if you're looking at the PowerPoint, pretty dedicated. I'm going to try to get through it without wasting a lot of time here. Not reading directly off the slides as I normally or would not ever really want to be doing. But if we're talking about multicultural counseling and competence and cultural competence, every counselor is expected to be developing cultural competence from the moment you get into your master's program until the moment that you retire. There is always this process of developing and continuing to build on your multicultural competence. Within multicultural counseling, we're recognizing diversity. We're embracing diversity. We are not practicing from a monocultural perspective. And if we think about the theoretical orientations, those theories, the theorists that came up with them a long time ago, really that the heart of the foundation of those theoretical approaches, Adlerian aside to a degree, because Adler was a little bit ahead of his time, I think, but you know, the perspective of minority clients was not even taken into consideration when those theoretical when these theories were being kind of proposed, developed, tested out, and built upon. And so it really, you know, even if we're looking at some of those postmodern theoretical approaches, you know, that's really when we see a little bit of more focus on culture, certainly within a social justice perspective and feminist counseling perspective, the approaches to counseling that came about after like the civil rights movement, we saw a little bit more of a focus on that. But really what we're seeing is more of an integration of cultural competence into existing theoretical orientations, right? And so there are different ways that you can be incorporating or infusing culture and multicultural competence into your counseling practice. And so I'm not going to go over the different types of models of cultural competence. I will say that, you know, in addition to those kind of the tried and true, been around forever theories, not addressing in their development culture at all, really we saw, and to a degree I think still see a lack of, I think, true dedicated space within counseling to culture, whether it be within the DSM, which up until only recently even addressed culture, looking at different types of assessments and how those are developed and normed and modified, because assessments that have been around forever, remember, those might have been and likely have normed on the dominant culture, wherever that culture may have been. And so now we're kind of reevaluating all of that. It takes time, effort, and work on the part of the counselor or the counseling profession in general to make the necessary changes to get us where we should be, and I don't think that we're there yet. With that being said, I think we're building, right? CACREP didn't always require a diversity course in their coursework. CORE before CACREP didn't either. It may have been something that was recommended or suggested, but you know, the cultural issues course that you guys are now required to take, I think was only a requirement whenever I went through, and that was a decade ago. So really, in the grand scheme of things, if you're working with a counselor who's been in the profession for 25 years, there's a possibility that in their master's program they didn't even take a course on culture, or have textbooks that infuse culture. If you looked at the class that I took, the cultural issues course, and you looked at the textbook that I used, you'd probably be a little bit appalled, quite frankly. because I think it was a little bit more of kind of reinforcing the stereotypes that exist rather than looking at somebody's lived experience and the perspective of clients and how we need to be reviewing our own worldview and asking about our clients' worldview and addressing these issues head on. And so things have changed, but really in a not that long of amount of time have we been making culture a focus of the education that we provide to counselors and the training. So if we're thinking about, and I think the main thing I want to kind of touch on from those first like 17 slides in terms of cultural competence is that you can be an effective counselor, but just because you're an effective counselor doesn't mean that you're addressing culture in the most appropriate way or in a culturally competent way. And there's always room for improvement. If we're looking at multicultural competence and where those areas that it resides, attitudes, knowledge, skills, and action, what we've been doing in this program so far is getting you, ideally, to look at your own attitudes and beliefs, address them, dissect them, be aware of them. In terms of knowledge, teaching you through coursework about how we infuse cultural competence into our practice, what that means in terms of ethics within this course. Even though I only started it halfway through, kind of putting that cultural and social issues content folder in, how we can incorporate culture into some of those traditional theoretical orientations, what that actually looks like in practice. Skills, that's more of an area in terms of cultural competence where you start to practice, and that's going to come through in your practicum and internship. And that, I think, and have found, is the area where we can get a little bit complacent, to be quite honest. And I put in this module a number of different resources for you guys. Different cultural assessment forms, things to consider when you're working for an agency, like the agency cultural competence checklist, ethnic sensitive inventory. When you get into your practicum and internship experiences, take a look at the agency and the paperwork, okay? Take a look at how they are asking questions. Are they asking questions during that intake period or on a kind of intake form that every person in the agency uses? Are they asking culturally relevant questions? Are they asking them in the appropriate way? Or what pronouns are they referring to clients as? Are they asking clients as part of that intake process what pronoun they prefer? How open are they to addressing issues of diversity within that agency? What is the population that of individuals that they're working with? Is their client population diverse? If so, how? If not, start asking yourself, why not? I find that when students get into those practicum and internship placements, we as educators only have a minimal amount of control, if any, on the client population that our students are seeing. And so if you are seeing clients that are representative of a diverse population, then we're happy about that. Obviously, I get happy about that. But I can only hope that the right questions will be asked, that you will see how your supervisors engage with clients that look and have different backgrounds than your supervisors do or that you do, and you'll be able to practice some of these skills and develop your skills in working with diverse client populations. Research continuously kind of shows us that even though we've made developments in how we approach diversity issues in the counseling relationship, what it does to the therapeutic alliance. We're still seeing that when you pair a counselor with a client and they come from different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, gender backgrounds to a degree, the individuals who are from minority populations are less likely to continue on with services if they're not seeing a client that they feel can understand them and who they are. And the way that I myself as a white female middle-class individual with education, the way that I have to address that in my relationships with the clients is to acknowledge it, acknowledge the difference, share my worldview to a degree, and ask the questions that need to be asked, put myself outside of a comfort level in order to facilitate the development of that relationship. And I don't know where I was ultimately going with that, other than, skill development in terms of competence, practice. And that's how we work on developing multicultural competence by way of skills. Action, again, that kind of takes it to the next level. Action comes from us kind of engaging in systemic change, whether that be an individual level with our clients, on behalf of our clients, within the agency, within our communities, as a whole, from a professional competency standpoint, all different levels of action that we can be engaging in order to ensure that the needs of our clients are met. If you are interested, so the American Counseling Association, the ACA, has a lot of different subgroups, of course. There are subgroups for group workers, there's counselors for social justice, there's ARCA for rehab counselors, all different types of subgroups. There's one that's focused on spirituality, if I could say that. So you can look into those different subgroups and join them, and there's a dedicated set of multicultural competencies that have been developed by the cultural issues subgroup of ACA. And so, again, that's something I encourage you guys to look at, and I should probably try to post that for you. I'll try to remember that. So if we are talking about how to do this, right? This is the question that I love the most getting from you guys in these discussion boards. How do you actually use some of these theories in practice? What does that look like? When we're looking at multicultural theory in practice, there's kind of three models that you can kind of go to, or that can kind of direct your work as a culturally competent counselor. The first being, I think, what happens more regularly, more often, cultural adaptation of a dominant psychotherapy. And that kind of speaks to some of those articles that I put in the cultural and social justice issues folders the past couple of weeks. But it does take it to a new level. And so when you're talking to me, especially in your papers, about multiculturalism and how it connects to your theoretical orientation, I need it to be more than just, I'm going to ensure that I am ethically practicing and treating all my clients with the same level of fairness and justice. So the actual adaptation, right? The adaptation part, it means changing some of these theoretical approaches, changing some of the language that's used, and kind of looking at slide, what I've got here, 21 here, taking into consideration these cultural dimensions when we're working with our clients. And this starts from the onset, making sure that we're asking the right questions, making sure that we are addressing things, as Pamela Hayes would indicate, in the work that we're doing, making sure that we are working for agencies that are open to all individuals and welcoming to all individuals, and that people have training, the supervisors have training, and that you're maintaining your competence around cultural issues that change regularly. Our understanding of different cultures changes. If you are going to be working in specific areas of the country, this becomes even more important. I worked with a lot of people like in the Florida area whenever I was practicing in South Florida. There's language barriers there. As somebody that is kind of more of a feminist myself, part of what I would have to do is really be reflective of my opinions whenever I would talk to a woman who was not as eager to get back into the workforce, for example, because her culture really didn't support women in the workforce in general. And so, that was something that I had to get through. That was me acknowledging my worldview and the difference between my worldview and my client's worldview. If you're working with any indigenous populations, there are a lot of different Native American reservations throughout this country, and depending on where you live, you may be working with individuals. So it's important to take into consideration where you will be working. Even those of you that are working in West Virginia, and my goodness, we need counselors to stay in rural areas. Appalachia is the culture, okay? And so there are cultural considerations that we have to think about if we're working with people in rural West Virginia, for example. So including, if we're infusing cultural issues, multicultural theory into those dominant theoretical approaches to therapy. That's something that isn't just done at intake and forgotten about completely throughout the rest of the relationship you have with a client. It's something that you're continuously doing and you're continuously addressing. And I think, again, the bigger question comes into play: how do I do this? How do I actually make sure that I'm infusing culture or addressing cultural issues in my practice? And the best way that I can describe it is that you have to be blunt and you have to be okay with feeling uncomfortable. And you have to be okay with acknowledging that you don't know everything about a specific individual and their culture, or both, and the intersectionality of both of those things, or their identities in general, and being okay in that feeling of discomfort when you have to ask a client and when you should be asking a client to explain something to you. And the worst thing that you can do is not address a cultural issue in the counseling relationship, because then that kind of it can really put a divide in that counseling relationship. It can kind of convey to your clients that not only do you not understand where they're coming from, their point of view, but you don't care enough to ask about it. And we do, right? And so if you're thinking about all those micro skills that we have to have, all those traits that we have as counselors, there are ways to frame that in a cultural perspective. We have empathy, but do you have cultural empathy? We have skills, but do we have skills that are reflective of working with individuals from minority populations? So it's something that you have to constantly be aware of. The second way that individuals infuse multicultural theory and practice is kind of on a more dedicated space using ethnic psychotherapies. And so this is more of an approach that so for me, I would not have ever called myself like a quote unquote multicultural counselor, okay? And because I feel like if I'm going to be calling myself a multicultural counselor, then I'm probably going to be using kind of the second approach to counseling as more of my orientation, meaning that I'm going to be engaging in the community that my client belongs to, asking about folk healing, asking about those network therapy approaches that a client might be using, network therapy being, again, kind of looking out towards the community. An example of this could be involving somebody's pastor or preacher within the counseling relationship, because the client is a very spiritual individual, or indigenous healing individuals within a community. So that's kind of that network therapy, not just limiting that counseling relationship to you and the client, or you and the family, or you and the couple, or whoever it might be. Including narratives into my practice. Narratives are different than narrative therapy. A little bit kind of in the same vein, but narratives are different in terms of how they're grounded. They're grounded in somebody's culture, right? The longest word ever, I swear, ethnopsychopharmacology. So acknowledging and working with psychopharmacologists that may be able to address some of those issues with medication, and what types of medication might be appropriate for an individual from a diverse background, and acknowledging that not every medication works the same way for every individual, which we all should be acknowledging anyway. But so again, in terms of kind of the second stage, I find that kind of using those ethnic psychotherapies is more of a dedicated orientation to multicultural counseling. And then the third kind of approach is the holistic approaches, which we spent an entire week talking about, contemplative practices and psychotherapies. But again, just to acknowledge that a lot of those are grounded and rooted in specific culture of an individual. So I'm just going to kind of leave it at that for right now. Again, the addressing framework, you'll be using it in the discussion board. I talk about a little bit on slide 27, but this is kind of that where you can, when you're going through an intake, and you know, I'm not going to say that every intake misses things. Certainly, intakes should be robust, and they should take some time, and you should be asking all the relevant, pertinent questions. But using the addressing framework, I find, is really nice because I think it actually addresses a lot of the, if not all of the minority categories that really we should be considering when we're trying to figure out who our clients are, when we're trying to frame the whole picture of who our client is. And so asking not only just their age, but considering generational influences, not bypassing any disability-related questions, asking about the presence of developmental disabilities in addition to you know, the onset of disability or illness at some other later stage in life, asking directly what somebody's religious beliefs are, what their religious background is, or spiritual orientation is, because those are two different things. Asking, of course, about age, ethnic and racial identity, socioeconomic status is incredibly important to be asking about, not only what their present socioeconomic status is, but where they came from, sexual orientation, indigenous heritage, and national heritage. Are they a first generation American? Do they hold dual citizenship? What is their background in that area? What does their family tree look like? Using a culture, or having clients do like a cultural genogram, can be really useful in trying to figure out, again, who our clients are and the world that they come from, especially if a client is hesitant, as clients should be and can be and will be, in sharing in a lot of depth their cultural backgrounds with you, especially at the onset. And so, again, I give you some examples of how you actually ask these questions on slide 28. The worst thing you can do is not ask the question. I will continuously try to drive that home. The worst thing you can do is not ask a question, or not do your research or homework if you don't know something about a client. So there is a lot of work that goes on in the background for you as a counselor in ensuring that you are maintaining a level of cultural competence that would enable you to actively practice ethically, right? Because if you lack cultural competence, then that probably, if in all cases, if not in like 99.9% of your cases, impact your relationship with clients that don't look like you do. And certainly we don't have intentions of doing that, but unfortunately it does happen. So I think that just about does it. Kept it almost at about a half an hour, but that was with some review of what else we have to think about for the remainder of the semester. Let me check real quick into the content areas. Yep, I think that's I think that kind of wraps it up for me. And so this will be the last time that I talk to you guys via video. I do have my office hours the last couple of weeks. If you want to be popping in, talking about anything. I put some information up within the last, within the finals week module. Obviously there's not a final in this class, but that's where the Dropbox is for your paper. I also put a little note in there about your course SEIs, ESEIs. I do appreciate you guys completing those, and I do look at them. So it's been great having you all this semester. I appreciate, again, all the hard work. I will miss you all next semester, though you'll be hearing from me from kind of a more clinical coordination side of things. Even though I'm not teaching, I'm still working. So feel free to reach out if you need to. Yeah, that wraps it up for me. Thanks, guys.